few things I want to share with you. And so, one of them is Hihani Washte. I want to give you my reflections on that. One of the things that a lot of people strive to do is to restore that way of life. It takes a lot. The young lady that's sitting back there, Colleen Mann, she's in Muskogee Creek. And she didn't know she was a descendant from the Muskogee Creek till she was 8 or 10 years old. And in some cases, it was not popular to be a Native American or a member of a tribe, particularly for those tribes that were on the east side, with perhaps the exception of the Iroquois Confederacy. These people they already had their nation. They were dealing with the United States before it was even the United States. And it was kind of an interesting thing that I had a chance to meet Oren Lyons a few months ago, and he was talking about sovereignty. And that's a big issue. And there's some definitions of that. Some will say we are sovereign. We are a sovereign nation in relationship with the federal government. But there's a little correction there. We were sovereign as a nation with the federal government. We were involved with the treaties, the several treaties, one of many treaties that were signed. We signed those as a nation. But the government turned around and they closed down, nor would they no longer accept the treaties, which were sustained in court, of course. And sovereignty is what Oren Lyons was talking about. And he said, way back when, around 1923, 22, there was discussion to make the Native Americans and the tribes, to make them citizens of the United States. Because they had a long relationship with the colonies, they got together and they talked about it. Do we want to become citizens of the United States? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no. We already have a nation. We have the Iroquois Confederacy of the 5 tribes that were there. And so they drafted a letter together, and it was more or less thanks but no thanks. We already have a nation. So they were not included in as citizens of the United States. From that standpoint, they maintained that. And that's even being challenged now because they have their own passports. And due to Homeland Security purposes, they would not accept their passports. But they sort of quietly, kind of lessened up on that. And they said they had been able to travel, but it was big news when the lacrosse team that they had were going to represent the Iroquois Confederacy in some world championship competition held in England. You probably remember that. Well, sovereignty, from a legal standpoint, is an ongoing battle for all the tribes that unknowingly, and I often think about that, unknowingly, because we did not have that much of a contact yet with the federal government. And so we stand on our treaties of 1851, 1868. We stand on those. We've gone into court. We're the longest withstanding court case that the United States has ever cumbered. And so, to us, we are sovereign. But along with that, and that's a whole discussion, maybe when we have our next conference, and we fully intend to have another conference next year. And again, we want to talk about some things, important things. They're all important. Our past is very, very important because that gives us the roots of who we are. But sovereignty, again, is within each and every one of us. The sovereignty in our structure, social structure, goes with the individual as well as the tiwahe, the family, the tioshpai, the oshpai, and the nation. We all fit in there. And we're starting, I really like the thought that was presented that it's a reawakening. And it's very similar to the Tatanka. When the new Tatanka calf is born, it stands up and its feet are wobbly. Hello. And it goes back and forth, and sometimes it sits down, or sometimes it falls down. But again, it gets back up. It gets back up, and within that day, it's running full speed with its mother and the rest of the herd. And we are Buffalo Nation people. Part of our connection is Pite Oyate. Pite is our word for the Tatanka. Before we became the Tatankas, it's an old word, Pite Oyate. It's kind of hard to say that, Pite, without putting spit all over the microphone. But that's our word. So the sovereignty is within us, and we all might be that calf that's staggering. But it's a new forward generation that I see you all because you're here to learn these things. And so I want to start with that one word, Ampetu Washte. That's a English movement of the English word to Lakota. If we said Ampetu Wash, Hinani Washte, Hinani Washte. If we said Hinani Washte, that's literally translated as good morning. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, you can use that. But if you're rebuilding yourself as an individual, later in Tiwahe, you ask the elders how that's said if you don't understand it. Because we don't say good morning. We wish you a good day. Not just the morning, the whole day. That's all. That's our Lakota thinking part, our Lakota perspective. So it's the whole day. And the whole day is a Betukilem, this whole day. So you're far more giving a greeting by wishing them for a good day rather than a good morning. In the English way, that's the proper way to say it. But in Lakota, when you greet somebody, you say, this is a good day. And if they're going to answer or say that to you, Ampetu Washte, you say, how, or do for the men. Women, shake hands and nod your head, because we always shake hands. Well, that's just kind of a short thing that I wanted to mention, because all of the speakers that have spoken the last 2 days have brought back a little bit of more of perhaps what you may not have understood before coming to this conference. But now we're going, maybe we kind of fell down a little bit, but we're getting back up. And so I just wanted to mention that to you. And we also have the Chanupa for being able to be standing on our 4 feet on Jimaka. We also have our Wocheke that's there prayer. They go hand in hand. And spirituality is very strong. Was very, very strong in the early days. And that's why I say, as Teton Lakotas, we were one of the most spiritual people. There are many, many people that are spiritual. But in our little sovereignty, our sovereign nation, as we say it, or our sovereign individual, prayer was always there. We mentioned that many times. So those are kinds of things that, I want to share with you as you go out. We close at noon, and we go our ways, but carry that with you. And so in that proper way, le abedo washtek tacha tokaya wocheke wa ogana unkia bikte. This is a good day, and so we're going to go forward in this day with a prayer. And each of you has a capability of being able to say these prayers. If there's only English, eventually move it back to Lakota. And I have a website called Lakota Circle Village, and there is a prayer in there, a healing prayer, and it's got the words written, and it's got the way to pronounce it. You can hear that prayer. And we all need healing every day. And so we put that prayer together, and it's there. And you can start with that prayer as you learn. As we reclaim our full sovereignty of who we are as a Woyande nation. So I'd like to call on Richard, spiritual leader, to offer a prayer. Richard. It gives me great honor to present to you Mr. Ephraim Dixon. And Ephraim, welcome to the conference.
Good morning and good day. My name is Ephraim Dixon, and as Leonard was saying, I grew up in northwestern Nebraska. Donna made a comment earlier that everybody has a gift, or everybody has a path that they will follow. For me, it was history from the very earliest age. When I was about 12 years old, we lived near an area where there was out in the rural country. My father had a ranch, and I would spend time each day visiting with people in my community to understand the history of this community. There's a small ghost town nearby, this old foundations, old buildings. And my first question was, well, what happened to this place? Why was it gone? Of course, my father didn't know, but he said, there's an elderly couple born in 1903 that lived about a mile from our house. Why don't you go talk to them? So at 13 years old, I rode my bicycle down to go interview them. And I remember the second, I started interviewing. I'd go down and visit them every weekend and visit with them, talk to them, tell me stories about what the old days were like for them in rural Nebraska. And pretty soon I started taking notes, and after a while I got a tape recorder for Christmas. I'll never forget the year I got a typewriter for Christmas. At 14 years I was great, so excited. So while other young people, teenagers were interested in cars and other things they probably shouldn't have been interested in, I had been earnest early focus on Lakota history. I became interested in the story of Fort Robinson that was located about 15-20 miles away from where I lived. And so I would go and visit with the curator and ask, how can I work at this park? I want to be a part of this history. And he said, well, we just don't hire high school students. And so I would harass him. Every time I would see him at the Dairy Queen or wherever, I would go and visit with him again and say, can I come work for you? And no. And so I finally found a federal grant that allowed teenagers, high school students, to work for a nonprofit organization. And I got 3 of my good friends to go with me, and I filled out all the paperwork and got the grant, and then brought it into him and said, now I can work for you, it won't cost you anything. So I got to start my freshman year in high school and then working at Fort Robinson. And that's where I learned Lakota history. I learned to kind of make that connection. And of course, Crazy Horse, this is the place where Crazy Horse was killed in 1877, and that kind of pulled me in. And by my senior year, as soon as I had a driver's license, I was driving up to Pine Ridge to meet elders and start kind of learning the history and trying to understand it. It's difficult as an outsider from that community to begin to pull together that history, but for over the 25 years I've been working on this, I've searched the National Archives, I've cast the net wide to try to understand Lakota history in a broad and balanced perspective. I say that as an introduction to say, why is it that I'm snooping on your families and asking questions of things that are not outside my family? I feel like Lakota families are my families now as well, as I've come to know and to care about many of you. I know sometimes that our history begins with understanding who we are. I got a chance to meet Arthur Sharple and his wife. We have corresponded by email, but this is our first introduction. And Arthur's family had a tragic incident where grandfather, that Sharple, who was killed in a car accident in 1935, and therefore lost a part of his history, his heritage. And through the work that I was doing, from the work that Kingsley was doing, we were able to kind of pull together the story of the Soreback Band, the band that surrounds Sharple and He Dog and all those individuals who had that community at the forks of the White River on Pine Ridge. And to help, provide some of the information. None of us who work on this stuff ever get rich. I have my book out on the City Mole Surrender Census. Last week I got my check from the South Dakota Historical Society for the entire year's worth of royalties, total of $81. So you have to understand that this is a labor of love. I spend my time and my effort, thousands of hours working on it, and I think of it as a gift to you. I think of it as what is it that I can provide that would be of value to the Lakota people as you understand your history and begin to interpret it. Today what I'd like to do is to show you a couple of presentations. I'd like to go back to what Arthur asked earlier, is how do we get our young people, your young people, to become interested in Lakota history? And so one way is perhaps a little bit of knowledge about how to find the sources. Increasingly, Kingsley and I and many others who are interested in this are getting emails from various families trying to track down their family members and reconstruct some of that history. It's helpful for us to be able to link you together to the sources. So today I'm going to talk about census records first of all, talk about how you get to census records, what you can learn from census records, what can you not learn from them. And then after the break, I'm going to introduce you to photographs, and talk about photographs as historic documents. How can you recover family history by looking at images? I have a dream someday that we'll be able to convince the Gall Lakota College to set up a conference or an event someday with scanners where all the family members can bring in their photographs and we can scan them and preserve them for the college so that they get preserved in the event of a fire or loss, that they're not completely lost to the family again. All right, and that's an introduction. I guess we'll kind of dive in. I'm going to stand down here with a walking microphone, and if you have questions as we go along, just raise your hand or interrupt me. It's a fairly informal process, and we'll talk about them. What can we learn from census records? Can you hear me with this? All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, well, let's begin by asking the first question is, as we want to dive in and understand something about Lakota true history, where does that true history come from? Where can you find that? And of course, the first list on the seal on there are Lakota sources itself. So what are the oral traditions within each of the Teoshkai? What are the songs? Think about all the history, all the culture, and the traditions that are encompassed within the music of Lakota. Winter counts, the annual notes about each of the years in Lakota history, as well as the ledger book art that has been created. Again, Amos Badhart-Bull's famous work from the Sorback Band is a great example of some of this ledger artwork that preserves the history of the Lakota. So there are many sources within the Lakota communities from which we can understand Lakota history. But I'm going to introduce you today to some of the non-Lakota sources, in particular talking about census records. So there are lots of people who interacted with Lakota through the last several centuries. And while they are viewing Lakota through the lens of their own prejudices and their own viewpoints of the 19th century or 18th century, these sources can give glimpses and give clues that help to link together to the oral traditions that help to understand things. So from Lakota sources like fur trade records that talk about the diplomatic efforts of various countries, Kingsley working on France, for example, in the 18th century, and Siouan interactions there. Army records from the various campaigns and the various interactions with treaties. The Bureau of Indian Affairs records, and of course photographs. And of course also other fields of inquiry like linguistics or archaeology can provide some context, some strands. So true Lakota history is like a rope that is woven together with lots of different strands. And I'm going to talk about just one of those tiny strands within this larger rope of Lakota history. Within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you can see there's lots of treaty negotiation paperwork. There are reports from the agents, Indian agents, on monthly reports, weekly correspondence. There are allotment records, the airship records, and the probate records like we see at Pine Ridge. But today I'm going to talk about census records in particular. Where are they, and what can we learn from census records? So Treaty of 1868 lays out the basic framework for the Great Sioux Reservation. It identifies the land base, and it identifies what the requirements are for the government for the Lakota. And in Article 10, there's a little sentence in there, and it says, and in order that the Commission of Indian Affairs may be able to estimate properly the articles herein named, meaning how much cattle will be issued, how much flour will be given out to the Lakota, it shall be the duty of the agent each year to forward to the Office of Indian Affairs a full and exact census of all Indians on which the estimate from year to year will be based. So the initial idea in 1868 as the reservations were being set up is that once a year the Indian agent would make an estimate of how much food and how much cattle would he need to support the Lakota families living there. And eventually the census records will evolve from a much more constrictive and much more different use, but that was their initial use. There's a great photograph taken in 1880 at the Standing Rock Reservation of one of the counting of the people, as it was called, at the census, taken by the very famous D.F. Berry photographer. And if you look there, here they're gathering for the census count. And in the early 1880s, what would often happen, especially at Standing Rock, is they would come in by their Teoshkai, by their band, as a group. And initially, the men and women were separated, so they would count the men separate from the women. Later, it was done by families. And you can see here are the census takers. Probably, the Indian agent is there, as well as several of the employees and the interpreters. And the families now are coming in, and they're getting their names recorded at the time in 1880. So when we look at these documents, the very early ones, the 1870s and 1880s, are just the head of the family, just the name of the man, and sometimes if it's the woman who's is a widow, for example, or it might be the eldest son of the family. So for example, here is just a single page from one of the issue lists from 1877 for Standing Rock. Here's the Unkpapa, and you can see Thunderhawk, one of the leaders of one of the Tioshbe at Standing Rock. And so you can see there's his name. You can see there's one man, presumably that's him. He's got 2 women in his family, 4 children, and then you can barely see it there, but there's the number 7, the total number in his family. And what's very important is you notice that these are arranged by Tioshbe. So as of January 1877, I can go down the list here, and here's everybody that's recorded within Thunderhawk's band. Now, do you think this information is accurate? Is there potential for errors? Well, of course, with any historical document, you have to look at it through the through the eyes. There's potential for mistakes, for errors, for misinformation, and so always kind of balance this kind of information. Now, if we jump forward about 10 years, I'll show you how the records will change. Here's the same record. This is a census account for Thunderhawk's band. But notice what's different now. Instead of just the head of the family, now the Office of Indian Affairs is becoming a lot more intrusive into personal lives of Lakota by demanding to know everybody who's there. So here is Chief Thunderhawk. We now know he's 49 years old as of this date. Here's his wife. Here's a daughter, their second wife, there's a daughter, the grandson's living there, and there's a niece there. With their ages, their name in English, and their name in Lakota. So you can imagine as you're trying to locate your family members, these could be very valuable sources of information. It's interesting reading some of the Lakota accounts of the census taking. There was a lot of resistance against the census counts. And in fact, you'll find, especially in the late 1880s up to the Ghost Dance period, there were many families you'll never find in the census count. They were not recorded until after the Ghost Dance. And there would be a lot of resistance. In 1874, for example, at the Red Cloud Agency among the Ogallala Lakota, the agent there, a man named John Seville, tried to do a count. And actually, they essentially arrest him and threaten a trial and a hanging if he insists on counting the Lakota. So it becomes one of the kind of contentious issues in the early years of the agency. But for our purposes here, for your purposes, this is a great place to find your family. So let's just take an example, take a few minutes and walk through one family example. I'm going to pick on Nathan because Nathan shared his story with me earlier, and we're going to kind of follow Nathan Blightman's story and see if we can find it in the agency records. But bear in mind, what I'm going to show you, I did in my hotel room yesterday. So this is something that's easily accessible online, and with a little bit of knowledge, anyone can do this. So let's see what we can find out. First place to start, of course, is always what do you already know within the family? What's the oral tradition? And so Nathan shared with me the information about his family. And so in particular, what I was looking for was a man named Charles Blindman. Is that your father, Nathan? Or grandfather?
That's my grandfather.
Grandfather. Okay. So Charles Blindman is the grandfather. So by entering it into the index and simply calling up on Ancestry.com, I was able to find the 1903 census, and here you can see him. So here's Charles Blindman, right here. This is a male, he's a son, he's 18 years old. Now look what else you can see about it. There's his father, or well, stepfather, we'll tell that story in just a second. But here's Blindman, a woman named Blue Whirlwind, we assume is the mother, and then there's a brother named Thomas Blindman. So once you find your first kind of hook into the census records, now this allows you to continue forward. Many, especially the later Pine Ridge Agency records, census records, will actually link, each piece is linked. You'll see it'll say, here's the last census number, and it links to the next census number. So just, you do follow year by year. The census was taken every year. So, let's take a look at this. All right, so here's what we've got for the Pine Ridge Agency census for 1903 for the Blindman family. So then I looked at the 1904 census and found it there. But notice it's exactly the same. The only difference is each of the individual's years or their age has changed in addition to 1 year. If I go forward to 1905, I can find here it splits. So Charles Blindman is now married to Katie. He's listed as 21, she's listed as 18. we see kind of this new emergence now of two families as the blind man himself continues. And if we continue following that out, year by year, these census records go all the way up to 1939. We can track this family's development over time. Yes, Nathan?
So when they got married, Charles Blind Man, that would be my other grandpa, Thomas, married Katie. So that's an error.
So again, oral history forms the basis for this. So what Nathan's pointing out is that there's an error in which who married whom. Again, are you shocked there's differences or changes? So you have to look at each census record not as an individual record accurately. What you're trying to do is link them all together and see the pattern. So my guess is I'll go further into the record, I'll find there's mistakes been corrected at some point, and Katie will be under Thomas. I stopped at a certain point. But again, you're using your oral history, your oral tradition, as your foundation on which you're building. This is simply one strand, and you can imagine these agency interpreters and folks collecting this information. They're collecting thousands of people's information, and it's not uncommon for ages to be mixed up, even sexes to be wrong, names to be incorrect. So you just look at it through the vantage point of it's a piece of information that can be helpful for you. And once you find the information, start moving forward, then the other idea is to move backwards in time as well. So there's the 1903 again. So here's 1895, moving back to 1895. I see the blind man family with his wife, Blue Whirlwind, and now there's two different names that appeared there. Now remember on the Pine Ridge Reservation, about 1900 or so, there's this movement to take Lakota traditional names and Americanize them. And they've given surnames of the family and given English first names. So here's a chance to see the potential for Lakota names that were given to them as children. Again, Nathan pointed out to me earlier that that wasn't Charles' name. He has a different Lakota name. But again, they give you clues and give you information that help you to kind of follow your family through. Oops. If I back up a little further, I'll find out that blind man's name listed in the census records again is named Acting Father, and there's a third child there. This is Old Thunder. Nathan told me that that's probably another son, a younger son, who died perhaps of wounds from Wounded Knee. And then finally, if I try to go back to 1890, the family is not listed. And so the story, the tradition within their family is that Spotted Thunder and his wife, Blue Whirlwind, are from Hunkpapa, from Standing Rock. They come down to Cheyenne River. They're with Bigfoot at Wounded Knee. He's killed, and this is the family that's left after that. And Blue Whirlwind then remarries. So Acting Father is a stepfather. And in fact, that Lakota name then kind of hints at his role as a stepfather for this new family as they go forward. So again, it's not to say that the census records are accurate, but they help give you patterns and little details that can help to fill in pieces or help to confirm information from your own oral stories. So if we look at the agencies as general, and across the whole spectrum, we'll find that there are lots of agency census records, but they all started a certain year. And so there's a few individual lists from the early 1870s, even one or two from the late 1860s. But essentially, most everything for the reservation starts in 1876. And the formal first real true census will start in 1886, and then continue on forward to 1939. But you'll notice I've got some gaps in here. So if you're like the Rosebud Reservation, for example, we're missing a whole series of years from the 1890s in which no records have been found yet. Or Pine Ridge, we're missing the 1891 census, which is a pretty important census. It's the year after Wounded Knee, when lots of these Minicosia families are incorporated into the reservation. One of those pieces we're missing that we'd love to be able to find. It shows up again in 1892. Notice lots of the early 1880s material is gone. There's one exception, and that's the Standing Rock Reservation. They have an amazing amount of records. It turns out the Indian agent there was had a tremendous administration in terms of keeping records. And in many years, in the 1870s, early 1880s, there's as many as 5 or 6 lists from every single year. You can track families from Standing Rock from 1876 up through the 1890s, at least once a year, and in some cases more than that. So I have 38 lists for Standing Rock from 1876 up through about the early 1890s. And what's important is that each one of these families are then listed by their Teoshnai, which allows you then to follow the evolution of Ushbek during that 15-year, 20-year period. So let's take a look at Standing Rock for just a second, since our record is so good. Here's a population for Standing Rock. Recall that there are 3 major groups there. You have the Yanktonai. This is a graph showing you about a year. There's 1876 on the left, 1893 here, and then these are numbers going up this way. So there's 500, 1,000 people, 1,500 people, 2,000, 2,500. So notice the yellow line here is the Yanktonai, and it stays pretty much the same, a little above 500 throughout that entire 15-20-year period. Among the, the yellow line is the Blackfeet Lakota, sorry. The purple line up there is the Yanktonai, and the dark blue line here. So what's happening here? There's 500 people here, and suddenly in 1881, just leaps up. What happens in 1881? Do you recall? Well, Donna knows the answer, though. So this, of course, is the return of Sitting Bull from Canada. So this represents all of these people coming in from Canada, and suddenly the census rolls down will suddenly just leap up, so that by the time everyone's at Standing Rock, there are almost 2,000 people living at Standing Rock at that time. So let's see what we can learn about that. So in early June of 1881, as the Lakota are coming in from Canada throughout 1880 and 1881, they're turned over. First of all, they surrender to various army forts, and then they're turned over to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They will go through a steamboat ride down to Fort Yates, and they'll come in 3 batches. The first will come in early June, about 1,150 from Fort Buford, and then in mid-June will come those from Fort Keogh, and then Sitting Bull's band will come in late July. And there's a 3rd group on these steamboats transported down to Fort Yates. Shortly after they arrive at Fort Yates, they're held as military prisoners of war. Within a few months, the first 2 groups are turned over to the Office of Indian Affairs, to the agency at Standing Rock. Sitting Bull, however, and his band will be kept as prisoners of war and then not released for another 2 years. And so you can see here's some great photographs taken by the several photographers coming into the Standing Rock area in 1880, 1881, as these prisoners are coming in and being held by the Army. There's some great views of the camp. There are great views of Crow King and others there in the photograph above. So it turns out that in 1881, something of very importance to Lakota history happens in terms of recording things. The United States government decides to conduct its first federal census. So it's important to recognize there are different types of census records. Everything I've been talking about up to this point have been Indian agency records, census that are done by the agent and his employees. There's also a state government. In the 20th century, a brief 10 years, there's a state census taken. But every 10 years, there's also a federal census. In 1790, a census of the entire United States. But since Native Americans weren't considered American citizens, they were overlooked and ignored throughout most of American history up until 1880. For the first time in 1880, the United States government said, we'll try to count all Native people in the continental U.S. Most historians believe the census had failed and that nothing was ever preserved. However, it turns out by research at the National Archives, they discovered that most records actually been turned in, they actually were done, they had burned, but we were able to find them and reconstructing second copies. And that's what I was able to do for the Standing Rock Reservation. This is the 1881 federal census that we reconstructed from 2 documents, one in Kansas City and one in Washington, D.C. And for the first time, it lists all of the men, women, and children that are coming in from Canada, as well as those who are living in Standing Rock. So the federal government is trying to now count everyone in Standing Rock. And to do that, however, the Indian agent doesn't have the staff. So the Census Bureau hires this man here named William Selwyn. William is a Yankton. He has been educated in the Episcopal Church mission school, so he speaks both Dakota, Lakota, and speaks English. And he was hired for 2 months to travel around the Standing Rock Reservation, meet with families, and to conduct the census. He's actually related to Sitting Bull's family. As Ladonna likes to say, everyone is related. Of course, he can find his relationship. His mother, I think it is a sister to Sitting Bull's father. And so they have a kinship relationship. And so in 1881, as he arrives on Standing Rock to do the census, he sits down with Sitting Bull first. And Of course, as a traditional Lakota way, they establish their relationship. And ultimately, Sitting Bull will say, brother, he gives a great speech that we found that had never been published before. He talks about this idea that here are all the wrongs the federal government has done to my people, but we are related. I give you permission now to go count the people. And so he begins this census count in 1881. This is reconstructed, as mentioned, from two pieces of it. The one that was destroyed by fire, about half of it has survived at the National Archives. Then I found a second copy of overlapping with different families in Kansas City at the archives there, and we were able to then merge the two together to come up with a full census. So let's see what we can find from the census. Here's a page. I know it's kind of faded, I apologize. This is the page for Sitting Bull family himself, and so what you see here then is Sitting Bull's name, Lakota, Sitting Bull. You have up here then his age, he's listed as a chief. You have his two wives, his family members, his mother is listed in here. Down below, the page below, it says how many dogs he has. He had 2 dogs at one time, a couple of horses, and it said how many buffalo he'd hunted the past year, how many deer he'd hunted the past year. So there's a great kind of snapshot of this family. For the first time actually see in the written record, then Sitting Bull and all these other individuals' families. If you look at the whole census as a whole, because we're interested in not just the families, but actually how all these Teoshbai as well, this is how it's organized. There are Hunkpapa first in the census first. There are Black people Lakota mentioned next. Now remember, there's lots of Minokoshu and Sanzark that are coming in as well. There's Ogallala, which includes the Kedog family there. There's a group of Brule. And then there's a Hunkpapa Blackfeet again, Yantonai, Upper and Lower Yantonai. And if we look at those closely, what we can see is that the census is divided into those who came in from Canada and then those who were living at the agency. So the first section of that census then is everybody for the first time. We get a glimpse of who they are and can connect them then to families that are living on the reservation today. So let's just take a second and look at the Hunkpapa, just as an example to see what can we use census records for to understand communities. We saw through the example with Nathan Blindman what you can do with your family, but now let's take it to the next level, because families are part of larger communities, are they not? We want to understand how these Teoshbai also interacted with each other. So in the census, there are 4 groups of Hunkpapa coming in from Canada: Sitting Bull, Crow King, Gall, and Rain in the Face. These probably don't represent Teoshbai. They represent groups that were related, but for administrative purposes, they were lumped together so they could have one representative kind of being a spokesperson for that particular group of people. But a total of 195 families that we want to know about. Now, if we take those individuals and those bands, and we follow them from 1881 forward through all the census records, we keep tracking them all the way forward, what we'll see is that very quickly, the group that came in as Crow King will split into 2 groups, Charging Thunder and Crow King. And when Crow King dies in the early 1880s, then High Bear will become the spokesperson for his Teoshbai. I try to use the word spokesman because I don't want to say they're chiefs or headmen, we don't know that. Again, many of these individuals that the government's going to see are the people they're interacting with, and so really they're functioning as a spokesperson with the U.S. government. They may or may not be the recognized band leader of that Teoshbai. Take a look at the second one of Gall's band. You can see that Gall's band splintered pretty quickly after its arriving at Standing Rock. And we'll see Black Moon's group, for example, which is the last coming in from Canada. Upon Black Moon's death, a young man named Iron Star will become the leader of that particular group, at least the spokesman for that group. And then Gall's group will also kind of scatter into several groups as well. By connecting those by the individual genealogies, we help to understand who these people are. Same thing with Rain in the Face. There's a Rain in the Face's role in Lakota politics begins to decline in the early 1880s. Standing Bear will take on many of the members from his band, and then Rain in the Face dies in 1884. So that's one way we can look at it. A second way we can look at it is understanding that just because they're listed in one Teoshbai in the census records doesn't mean that's how Lakota people viewed it. The census record is how the Indian agent viewed it, and of course he's viewing it from a different perspective. So let me give you an example. Here's 2 prominent individuals, leaders at Standing Rock. On the top is Thunderhawk. On the bottom is Running Antelope. Running Antelope was much often aligned with the U.S. military at Fort Yates and was oftentimes at cross purposes with the Indian agent. The Indian agent constantly complained about running antelope. And at one point then, you'll see here in the census records, in 1881, he finally stopped recognizing running antelope as his own band leader and lumped him in and pushed him into Thunderhawk's band. And for administrative purposes then, his collection of rations was then kind of managed by Thunderhawk, who the agent considered to be a more moderate leader. And so we'll see kind of a peak in the numbers of people there as these two bands are administratively lumped together, but that doesn't necessarily represent what's happening on the ground. So sometimes we have to be careful when we look at these records as to what was political and what's real. The second thing we can look at is what was the following of a particular leader. So let's take Sitting Bull as an example. When he arrives at the Standing Rock Agency in 1881, he obviously has this core following. And in an effort to break his leadership, the Indian agent there began breaking his band into small pieces. And so you can see the splintering there. Those are all the names of all the individual groups that the Indian agent recognized, and that's whom he would interact with and who he issued rations to for that group, in an effort to break Sitting Bull's influence in the area. But I'd like to point out, this is the number of people that's recognized in the census records of Sitting Bull's band. What you'll see in the 1880s is that Sitting Bull's influence, if you will, the number of people in his band were slowly declining. But then starting by 1885, as we approach the ghost dance, the number of people coming into his band begins to rise again. And what's interesting is if you look at who's coming into his band, and look at the individuals, they're all young people. They're all 20-somethings. They're all early 30s. They're typically single. So what's happening here? Well, here's the issue as we're marching towards getting closer onto the ghost dance. Sitting Bull is now becoming a magnet for young people looking at the old life or looking at a new approach. And for some reason, he's now beginning to attract a new audience that perhaps he wouldn't have had in the past. Army officer once wrote, when he described the Lakota culture, he said it's really America's true democracy. Think about that today. In the 19th century, if we'd had the political problem that the Congress had this week, what would have happened the next morning was that the band would have split. One Teoshbe would have stayed on the camping ground. Those who disagreed would have taken down their lodges. They would have moved a select distance over, set up their lodges, and the two bands would have just simply separated on this idea of politics built on consensus building. Because for a politician, that meant that every day was a referendum. Every decision you made, you had to think about the current, whether people would follow you today or to not. As opposed to we elect people for 4 years and then you don't get a chance to re-elect them for, or unelected for another 4 years. So when you look at these lines, what that shows you is, here's what Lakota opinion was about those individuals, assuming the numbers are accurate. So we see that Sitting Bull had been losing followers. But what's important to me is that starting in 1885 then, he's now gaining followers, he's gaining influence, and who is he gaining influence with? Now, those census records allow us, again, trying to reconstruct that kind of history to understand those individual Teoshbe. A couple more slides just to introduce you to some other folks that are in the Sitting Bull surrender census. Just pointing out that the Minnekoju Sanzark that are coming in will stay at Standing Rock now for a little less than a year before they sit on the Cheyenne River. So we'll get very famous families like Foolheart, Circle Bear, Hump, and Spotted Eagle. And of course, we'll have the Oglala delegation as well. So some of your relatives, I know Arthur's relatives are in this group. They're coming in from Canada. They'll be at Standing Rock. And then in early 1882, they'll be transferred down to the Pine Ridge Reservation. So individuals like Big Road, He Dog, Iron Crow, Little Hawk, and Low Dog, who's described as an upstart with a very young man who has a group circulating around him. I apologize, I talk really fast, I get excited. All right, so conclusion. So what is it about census records that we can learn? Well, a couple of ideas I want you to take home. And the first one is that from an individual family perspective, you can learn lots of information about your family and relationships and connections by following the census records. But second, not only does it allow you to look at families through time, it allows you to look at these communities through time, how these communities changed over time. These Teoshbe, while they have a core family grouping around them, there are constantly people coming and going, marrying and moving out, marrying and moving in. There are political splits, there are all these kinds of issues that are happening, or merging of bands together. All of that is part of this Lakota history that we want to understand. That chronology helps us to put everything else into some kind of context. So census records are one of the clues that help us to understand the Teoshbe on the reservation and in this kind of early period. It help us connect to these pieces to the oral traditions. And finally, I think census records can help us understand something about the influence of particular individuals, their leadership, the rise and fall of the members of their band. Take a Standing Rock where the Indian agent is actually recording. If you were coming in for your agency's rations and presenting your ticket, and you could, simply say, I'm moving over to so-and-so's band, and then your line would be crossed out and moved over and rewritten into the new band's list. So they were changing every few weeks. It gives you almost a real-time perspective of the politics and changes that were happening. Okay. Talk really fast. Any questions or thoughts or questions about census records? Yes?
You think it's interesting that the agent at Standing Rock was McLaughlin, who was basically, from what I understand, a single neighbor problem.
So our questions regarding McLaughlin and Sitting Bull. So understand that census, so the whole ration process and the census taking, for example, will be tools that some Indian agents will use in an effort to limit the influence of certain leaders or to elevate leadership. So obviously, what's happening is once the reservation period has begun, it's not just Lakota politics. Now you have this added influence of the Indian agents and interpreters and other people who are trying to influence or will influence politics. So certainly, so an Indian agent like McLaughlin was caught between a rock and a hard spot. Washington, D.C. demanded that he try to break down these Oshbe communities and try to break down the leadership. But the challenge was he's a one person with lots of different individuals working for him, and he doesn't have enough. There are thousands of people in Standing Rock. So he needs Lakota leaders who support him to be able to get rations out, to do negotiations, and to take care of all the kind of daily activities that happen on the reservation. So he's between a rock and a hard spot. He needs leaders. At the same time, he doesn't want leaders who are disagreeing with him. And so what we'll see is the whole 1880s, 1890s, well into the 20th century, this kind of political dynamic between the power that Indian agents have and the native power structure on the reservation. And ultimately, what's really interesting to me is that Indian agents believed they would break that power over time. But what I find very interesting is how the Oshbe and the traditional power structure has remained constant, has remained intact all the way through this time period, and continues. So it provides a foundation for the Lakota life. So just remember, when we look at these papers, what we're seeing is what the agent's perspective is. And it may or may not represent what's happening on the ground. I've talked to some Lakota families who describe how their families, when it came time for the census count, they would give erroneous names, they would give funny names. And so, of course, the Indian agent wouldn't know what it meant, and so they would call out this person's name, and there would be a little snickering by the other folks next they knew what it really meant. Or in some cases, it may be recognizing relatives who are no longer there. The names may appear on there to help bring in additional rations that can be distributed out. So the census is kind of this, it's not a pure mirror, if you will. It's a fuzzy mirror, which we have to be able to juxtapose it against other traditional accounts and other oral histories. But yes, Indian agents didn't use the census anyways. Fiscal comment.
I'll say that when they did the census, because of the new rules that are coming out, a man would bring in one of his wives and record all his children on one wife. And then the next time he came in for the census, he brought the other wife. And then all the children are recorded under that wife. And then as they would go through the census, the man who brought in all of his wives, then all of a sudden they're recorded as sister-in-laws, aunts, but they are his wives. So you have to look at the census and not say this is what's down there, because it changes constantly. And one of the things that I really have to laugh about the census, they come in, when it comes to the women, she looks to be about 40, and he looks to be about 25. So they record his wife 20 years older than him, but as the census goes on, you know that the wife is starting to get younger and younger. Pretty soon the wife is the same age as her husband. So I always tell people, don't pay close attention to the ages, because it's a best guess age. We estimate he's about 60 years old, so he must have been born in 1840. And And then you go down the census and he gets younger and younger. So I always tell people it's the best guess age because we didn't have, in 1841 he was born June 7th. We didn't have that concept. He was born in the winter, the spring. So I always caution people, don't take too much concrete at the ages because if you go through the census, the women always get younger by the time they're older, they're almost the same age as their husband.
And I've noticed as well that you'll find additional names, you'll find young children who perhaps died in infancy who will not be remembered in the traditional history. So sometimes you can add, but yes, always word of caution for all that. Yes, Arthur? Yes?
I noticed that it's called Police Force Training, but Police Force is not listed as the number one person section. Matter of fact, I go through the ledger before I find my Police Force. And even then I had questions. And then I went to Kedo's thing. Discovered we had 4 brothers, but none of the brothers' names are the same as what's been recorded.
So what Arthur brings up is the 1876, 1877 census that was done at the Red Cloud Agency in Camp Robinson. As the first 2 sections are at the Red Cloud Agency, and then there's a section toward the back which lists all of the individuals, the families coming in with Crazy Horse and surrendered in May of 1877. It's important when you look at those that, again, those are the imperfect viewpoint of an Indian agent who didn't understand Lakota politics or the Teoshme structure, and so they're oftentimes groups. You'll see a Cayuga grouping in there, but in fact there are a number of Teoshmes all kind of melded in there together. You'll see Red Cloud in the 1876 portion of that, but when you move over to 1877, because he'd been had gotten crosswise with the Indian agent and had been demoted, his band was merged into a different band. And so when you see the Crazy Horse band, it's not Teoshme per se, it's really a number of Teoshme all kind of melded together, but it's everyone who's coming in with, roughly with that grouping. So some are related, some are not. Because it's the first of the census being taken, oftentimes we'll find we can't match the names up to the modern census records. So many people probably gave incorrect names, and again, most Lakota have many names, and so you have nicknames, you have formal ceremonial names, and some were misinterpreted, any variety of reasons why they didn't be there. So particularly the 1876 ones, especially from Red Cloud and some of the other agencies, the military census ones are a little bit more difficult to match up. Once you get into kind of the Bureau of Indian Affairs census records, there seems to be a lot more consistency where you can track people through time. But you're right, we can't always match up every person in the Crazy Horse section there, who they are. Did you have a question over here?
Yeah, I purchased your book last summer, I think, or last year, and my grandpa knife chief is in your census. My grandpa knife chief is in that census, but also my grandpa Ironclad is also in that census. And the other, when I looked at Crazy Horse's surrender ledger, also my grandpa knife chief is also in that surrender ledger. And the other thing I was wondering about, I wonder what remember right after the Little Bighorn, people were retaliation against the people that defeated their golden boy, the custard, so I wonder if people might have changed their names or just so that they wouldn't get any retaliation from the government, and then I was just curious about the Wild West shows, because Buffalo Bill, he took a lot of our tribal members, and I wonder if the censuses were going on whenever they were out in Europe or someplace.
So several questions there. Buffalo Bill, Cody, and not only Cody's Wild West shows, but the others. Oftentimes with the Wild West shows, the family members would still be on the reservation, and so generally I'll find them still on the Indian Agency census records, even if they're off with Cody in Europe or wherever. But in some cases, in some census records, you'll see them missing from there. So again, that's part of the thing is you're tracking it year by year, your family, and suddenly there's a gap. But there are other records we can go to for like Buffalo Bill Cody's. There are lists of who's traveling with the shows and what year. Within the correspondence files, there's occasionally a list from someone saying, well, here's the individuals we'd like to go, or here they are returning from this particular show or from this event. So you can pick up the names there and kind of track those people down. Yes, and I get back to the 1876-77, certainly there were concerns and fears about punishment or retaliation by the U.S. Army. And so no doubt that some people gave incorrect names. And also, there are many people who won't be recorded in there, who didn't come in. They slipped into the agencies at night. At Standing Rock, for example, the Indian agent there and the Army are constantly arguing with each other about the number of Lakota out on the Standing Rock reservation. And the Army officer argues, every time we do it, the numbers keep increasing, but they're all slipping in into the agency at night and not presenting themselves and getting their names recorded. So he knows there are lots of people there who don't show up on the rolls. And certainly even up to the late 1880s, 1890s. But after Wounded Knee, from about 1893 forward, we see less and less of people who disappear. By 1893, it's really a pretty, everyone is there. You can track them across pretty consistently across time. But once kind of before Wounded Knee era, there can be a lot of people who are missing, simply because they were living a traditional life and were not coming in for a census count. Is there any other hand? Yes, sir.
After 1877, after they killed Crazy Horse, there's 900 of us that was put on the Cheyenne River Reservation. Is there any other census besides that?
So there are lots of other census. So for Cheyenne River, for example, there is an 1876-77 ledger, just like the Crazy Horse Surrender ledger. It's an Army ledger book for that time period. And then there's a missing gap in the early 1880s for Cheyenne River. So from about, my recollection is about 1879 to about 1885, there's a big gap there. We have nothing from Cheyenne River, and then it picks up in 1886 forward from there. So depending on what years he was at Cheyenne River, your family was there, it's possible to pick them up either in the earlier ones or the later ones.
I was just talking about that. There's only 900 that were brought after Crazy Horse was killed. 900 of us. The 4 bands were put on Cheyenne River. That's all.
Well, I'd love to visit with you after and learn some more about which bands those are and see if we can track down those movements.
The Sans Art, the Closure, 2 Kettles, and Blackfeet.
Okay.
We were the 4 bands that brought to Cheyenne River after Crazy Horse was killed.
So, and remember, Cheyenne River existed before Crazy Horse was killed, and so there were lots of those tribal members there, but there were certainly a lot of Teoshbe, Minnekoju, who aligned with the northern, the Crazy Horse factions and the other northern factions, the traditionalist factions, and that would end up on those reservations. And Ladonna's pointing out also, we'll see Blackfeet Lakota at both Cheyenne River and at Standing Rock. And we'll see a lot of migration, again, because everyone's related. It's not unreasonable to see people moving back and forth between reservations. And in fact, moving up to Canada, you can see in the 1880s in the Standing Rock records, for example, there are requests by Blackfoot's family or others saying, I want to go visit relatives in Canada, coming back again across the Canadian border. So there's a very fluid kind of time period with lots of people moving around. And the Office of Indian Affairs and the BIA eventually would really try to crunch down on that by the 1880s, and because their concern was that you were getting counted here and then moving up the Cheyenne River, getting counted there, and then moving over to Standing Rock, making a circle, essentially, and so there'll be increasingly more constrictions placed on being able to allow Lakota to leave the reservation and be able to account for them. So these census records move from being a document intended for accounting purposes to understand how much rations were needed for treaty obligations, to being almost a compulsory, it's a control document, a way of tracking who people are, where they're supposed to be at. And so its purpose will evolve considerably over time. Thank you. So we're going to dive into the second part here. Again, mentioning that there are lots of different kinds of records to which to go to search for Lakota history. I want to recognize Bruce Brownwolf is here from Cheyenne River. Bruce also mentioned I didn't have on my list church records, another important part. As the Episcopal Church and later the Roman Catholic Church become integral parts of the reservation, there are lots of records related to families as well as history, Lakota history can be found in those documents. So another place to go and search for. But I want to take a few moments and kind of introduce you to a different group of historical documents that sometimes people don't think of as historical documents, and that is photographs. Photographs are a visual record, and all of us have photographs, and one of the things I'm on a campaign for is to get folks to take it into the Lakota College or wherever and have them scanned and have them preserved so that if there's ever something that's damaged or lost, that those images aren't irreparably lost. So what I want to do in this little time we have left is to kind of introduce you to what we can learn from photographs, give you a couple examples, and to use as our example, we're going to go to the Red Cloud Agency in the 1870s, the predecessor to the Pine Ridge Reservation. It's down near Fort Robinson. And we'll look at photographs from the 1870 era and look at what could we look at those photographs. There's many oral traditions and knowledge of cultural that would help us to interpret these photographs better than perhaps we can today. And, but we'll show you what's available and how we look at photographs as documents. So I'm going to put up a photograph, and this is an interactive piece, so let me ask a question. I want you to use your critical eye, and I'd like you to look at this photograph, and raise your hand and tell me one thing about this photograph. Tell me something that you see or can learn or know by looking at this photograph. Yes, ma'am. So she says props. And again, one of the challenges whenever we look at studio photography is, are the items that people are carrying or holding something they brought to the studio with them? Or are they things the studio or the studio props that were provided? So are these historical, or are they, so is the photograph changed or altered in some way? So remember, as we look at a photograph, there are several individuals here who are influencing what you see in the photograph. Obviously the photographer he's framing it, he's lighting it, he may be adding props to it, but also the person who's in the photograph influences what's there. He didn't come in naked. I mean, he or she was wearing something, brought in something. So can we look at a photograph and tease that out? Can we figure out what's, in this case, can we figure out what is real and what's not real? That's a good question. So looking at the things they're holding, or the things that they're sitting on, or whatever, that could be helpful. What else, when you look at this photograph, what can you tell about it? What would you want to know about it?
Which photograph?
The photograph we're looking at on the left there. Can you see it? Am I in the way? So what would you want to know about this photograph? Anyone care who he is? Right, so you want to know who the person is, right? You want to know when it was taken, where was it taken, who took it, just kind of when, what, where kind of questions. So when we start looking at photographs, it's not just simply a photograph of somebody, it's also trying to put in the context of that photograph itself. On the back of many photographs, you'll find the stamp or the piece of the photographer who took the photograph. In this case, you'll see the name on there. It says D.S. Mitchell. I'll introduce you to him in just a moment. But he's a photographer who came to the Red Cloud Agency in 1877 and took this absolutely amazing series of Lakota Oglala leader photographs. So, art or business? It says he dog, right? So is it the he dog, your he dog, or is it another he dog? How would we know that? So one of the questions, of course, is hopefully it is in your family. That's part of your family grouping, part of the Swarbeck man. But ultimately, there's a he dog on the Rosebud Reservation. And so what we'll oftentimes find in the photographs is that over time, these names can get mixed up and the identities can get stirred up. So we're going to try to sort those out. So we want to look at what's in the photograph. We want to understand where it was taken at. How can we figure all those kind of pieces out? So to do that, we're going to go down to Fort Robinson. For those, I think many of you probably have been there before, on the little hill overlooking the buttes there, the site of the Red Cloud Indian Agency, the predecessor to the Pine Ridge Reservation. It was moved from Wyoming to this location in 1873. It would be there through the Great Sioux War of 1876, 77. It would be there at the time Crazy Horses bayoneted at Camp Robinson. And then in the fall of 1877, it's moved to the Missouri River. And then in 1878, it's moved to its present location and becomes the Pine Ridge Reservation. So that's what it looked like, last year. But here's what it might look like in the 1870s. Here's a little drawing. Let's kind of get ourselves oriented here. Here's a view now looking on the Red Cloud Agency. And what you'll see is this kind of very two-story structure here, an L-shaped building. This is the warehouse where all of the food rations coming in, the flour, et cetera, would have been stored. When you came in for your weekly food issue, the women would bring in a ration ticket and come in this large door, present it at a counter there. Your name would be checked off on a roster, and then the food would be issued. Initially, it was issued out to Tioshbe, originally to a groupie, and then the leaders would distribute it among the band. But in the mid-1870s, there's a movement away from that. Again, an effort by the BIA to kind of break Lakota leadership's control over bands. They started issuing out to individuals. There'll be a change in issue policy and procedures. So this is a warehouse, and that contains the food rations, materials for the next year. There's council houses here and offices there. Eventually there'll be an Indian agent's house there. There's stables back here. Schoolhouse eventually built here. This drawing shows in 1874 as the Army is coming in for the first time. And so we see a series of military tents set up here for officers. Here's the enlisted tents. And for the first few months, Camp Robinson was located right adjacent to the agency. And ultimately it was moved a mile and a half away and became what would eventually become Fort Robinson. And so we're interested then in the photographers who kind of visit this place. And here's a snapshot, or I say snapshot, but it's a photograph of what this place would have looked like around a ration day as everyone's coming into the agency. Now understand when we're taking photographs in the 19th century, it's not like our digital cameras today. You know, we snap a picture and we can erase it. To produce a photograph was an extremely expensive process and a time-consuming process. In the 19th century, this time period, a lot of what was done was on a piece of glass with light-sensitive chemicals put on. It would then be put into the camera, it would be exposed for several seconds, and then that would be immediately taken into a dark room, usually in a tent, and that would be stabilized, and then from that you could print onto a sensitive, light-sensitive paper. It was a lengthy process. To produce a single photograph like this can take about 45 minutes to an hour, maybe even an hour and a half, depending on the conditions. So each photographer carefully looked at what they were taking. It was a cost for them to produce that image and a time-consuming process. Therefore, they staged or decided where they would take the photograph very carefully. It also means that any kind of movement, because it takes a several-second process. So, for example, you can see here's kind of a ghost shadow here. This horse and that individual has now moved to another location, and that will kind of ghost the image and make it somewhat fuzzy. But you can see there in the center, there's the issue house, the big two-story building with the door open where people will be coming in to receive their rations. Here you see the schoolhouse, the very first Oglala Lakota schoolhouse set up by the Episcopal Church. And then here is one of the trading stores where the Lakota Oglala could bring in cattle hides and trade them for metal knives or other items, food items, things that they wanted to purchase for their families. And then a mile and a half away would be the military fort of Camp Robinson. Again, a photograph taken in 1877. This year, some new photographs have just appeared. These are not published yet. But here's a photograph of Camp Robinson taken in 1877, probably right before or right after Crazy Horse was bayoneted. Here's the post hospital. Here's a series of buildings. This is the building I want to kind of zoom in on just a second. It's the first 1877 image we have of the guardhouse where Crazy Horse was bayoneted. The building's been reconstructed now by the Nebraska State Historical Society, but that's what the structure would have looked like on the day that Crazy Horse was taken in. So photographs then can help us to see these places in the same way that other Lakota would have seen them in the 1870s. Because of Little Bighorn and because of the surrender of Crazy Horse, there was a lot of interest in the Red Cloud Agency, and in fact in all the Lakota agencies. And photographers began coming there to begin taking photographs. The hope was they could earn money by it. Take photographs of the people of Oglala and then sell them back east to people who are interested in knowing more about Lakota life. And so what I've been doing is trying to track who's been coming to the agency and taking photographs. So you can see a couple individuals came, but in 1877, around the surrender and death of Crazy Horse, is a time period when a number of photographers came and produced images. So all the photographs I'm going to show you are coming from this small group of photographers who were there. Now, some of them, like this particular one, was taken in 1874. It's our earliest photograph we have from the Red Cloud Agency. It's a daguerreotype, meaning that instead of a negative, it's actually printed onto a piece of metal, and it's only one copy. You can't ever make a second copy of it. And this was done by Lieutenant Thomas Wilhelm, who was a hobbyist photographer who had come about 2 months after the Army had arrived there. And you'll see on the right-hand side, number one, there's the Army officer who was kind of leading the photographer around. That's Lieutenant Carter, who's helping the photographer introduce to various individuals. The only person identified, only Oglala identified on there is number 2, Red Dog, who is a famous leader of the Upe Oglala, oftentimes a spokesman aligned with Red Cloud, and somebody whom we will meet again. In the fall of 1876, after Custer's defeated Little Bighorn, a couple of photographers came into the Red Cloud Agency, most famous of which is Stanley Morrow, who came out of Yankton, South Dakota. And he took a series of photographs. This particular one is taken right after Red Cloud was arrested. You may recall in the fall of 1876, Red Cloud and Red Leaf had moved their Chioshbe away from the agency. They were somewhere between kind of Crawford, Shattern area today, and they had been becoming increasingly isolated from the agency politics there. And Red Cloud was speaking a lot more negatively towards the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so the Indian agent had him displaced. And so he was demoted as the head chief of the Red Cloud Agency. And Spotted Tail, who was the leading rule over the Spotted Tail Agency, was then named the leader for both the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail Agency. And on that day, General George Crook, the commander of the Department of the Platte, came to Camp Robinson in the Red Cloud Agency and was there for this kind of ordination of Spotted Tail as the chief of both of these agencies. And if you look in this photograph, Morrow was there that day. And we can see there's General Crook standing there, and we can see a whole range of individuals then, including Spotted Tail, and among others. Lots of folks have been trying to debate about who else is in this photograph. But again, you have a chance to see what's the attire, what's the use of blankets, etc. in this fall day in October of 1876. And of course, at the same time, he was able to get a portrait of Red Cloud. This was taken probably outside J.W. Deere's trading store, which was right next to the agency. Deere was from Virginia, and had a Confederate who had come west after the Civil War and had made him a new life as an Indian trader. And so he's trading with Lakota for buffalo hides and has a lot of relationships with Oglala. And so he will negotiate for many photographers to be able to take portraits of individuals, including Red Cloud. So this photograph has been published many times, but last year we just found a new image. This is taken from the same set. And so here we have Red Cloud again. This is Red Cloud here with his, in October of 1876. These individuals standing in the back are the Deere brothers, J.W. Deere and his 2 brothers who are operating this trading store. And so Morrow has taken a photograph of Red Cloud. Again, a new one that we haven't known about until just this past year. So another photographer who came out in 1877, a man named Charles Hamilton, and his son also came out shortly afterward. And so my assumption is the son has a camera behind him, is taking a photograph of Mr. Hamilton, taking a photograph of Oglala. This is at a temporary little photo studio right between the Red Cloud Agency and Camp Robinson. And you can see here he's got a group of Oglala, particularly ladies here, long earrings of the fancy blankets of the time period. But notice the photographer, what he's done. He's cut a hole in the roof of the studio and has put a translucent covering over the top of that in an effort to bring light inside and be able to do studio settings inside in a very traditional way of trying to light up subjects. So it's a great image. That's one of our few images we have of a photographer actually working in this particular area. Again, this is a new photograph, unpublished, it's just come to light. And Hamilton didn't do a lot of Indian portraits, a lot of Lakota portraits. He did go to the Spotted Tail Agency and did a series of Brule portraits, as well as Minokoju, who had come in with Crazy Horse and are living at the Spotted Tail Agency. The most famous of which you probably have all seen this image of Touch the Clouds. So that was taken by this photographer, Hamilton, at the Spotted Tail Agency in 1877. And of course, they also moved their camera around the Indian encampments in the area. So there's lots of opportunities here to study Oglala Lakota culture of this time period. There's lots of great views of different sites, and you can see the way the lodges were set up. You can see all the kinds of materials in and around these lodges. This is Little Big Man's lodge, taken in 1877. This is a second photographer. He was actually a private in the Army in 1877, and he was with an expedition that was mapping roads in the region. And so he stopped the agency for about a week and took a series of photographs, both the Red Cloud Agency and the Spotted Tail Agency. This one is over at the Spotted Tail Agency on Beaver Creek, and at this point the photograph shows the issue of cattle. So the cattle were run out of corrals and then shot and butchered. The hides would then be traded to trading stores, and the meat distributed among the families. Private Howard's most famous photographs, the ones that are historically significant to the Oglala people, of course, are images like this one of Crazy Horse's grave. So you may remember as Crazy Horse is bayoneted on September 5th, 1877. His body is taken over to Camp Sheridan, the Spotted Tail Agency, where it's put for a while on a scaffold grave. And then once the Spotted Tail Agency and Red Cloud Agency are being moved to the Missouri River, the Crazy Horse family will take the body and go somewhere up onto the Piners Reservation, presumably, and rebury. So this is a photograph of that scaffold grave where it was there for that couple-month time period. Recently, just a couple years ago, a new image has also come out. This is a second view of Crazy Horse's grave, taken from the other side, in the other direction. And so we get these two kind of really good snapshots, if you will, of what the scaffold grave looked like in 1877. So these photographers are kind of coming around and taking lots of exterior, lots of kind of scenery that they think that they may be able to sell back east. But the most important photographer is a man named D.S. Mitchell, who had a photo wagon like this you see here. And he comes to the Red Cloud Agency in the late summer of 1877, and he is a talented portrait artist. And so he has hatched out this idea of, instead of just taking scenery shots of the Red Cloud Agency and encampments, what if I could take a photograph of every prominent Lakota headman, every Oglala Teoshbe leader, and have it as a set? And so he produces a series of 54 photographs, many of which have never been published before, that are beautifully well lit, they're sharp, they're clear, and they portray these Lakota leaders as they existed in 1877. So of course, here's a photo of his portrait of Chief Red Cloud, headman of the Sika, the Bad Face Band at the agency. We heard yesterday, or the day before yesterday, about Cayuxa and the rise of Little Wound and his, as the senior leader over the southern Oglala. Here's D.S. Mitchell's portrait of him. And again, I think as we look at these images, what you're looking at is all the cultural items that we can learn from. So he's got his blanket wrapped around his waist. He's holding his left hand, his pipe. He's got his pipe bag. He's got a medal around his neck from his visit to Washington, D.C. that year. He's got his hat and feather. All these are details, and we look at these photographs to understand, are they communicating something to us? Photograph of Red Dog. Anyway, Red Dog is with his weapon and his ammunition pouch out, his fireman's shirt on. Now what's interesting about these photographs is that Mitchell initially set up a studio, well lit, and he actually brought along with him a painted canvas backdrop to put behind the Lakota leaders. And you'll see it, you can get an impression of it here. It's got a fountain on the left, you got kind of a tree bush on your right there, very fancy Victorian. But at some point decided that wasn't the image he wanted to portray for his series of photographs. And so what you'll see is that in many cases he's hung a blanket behind the individuals, kind of flattened it out so that you don't see that. In a few of the negatives we'll see he's actually gone in and painted an Indian lodge over the top of the fountain on his backdrop as a way of kind of disguising it. Here's Little Hawk, again in the Hunkpatilo Crazy Horse Band, the uncle of Crazy Horse who's come in and surrendered in 1877. And the man on the left is Lieutenant William Philo Clark, later famous for his book on Indian Sign Language, but he was in charge of the Indian Scouts in 1877. And he looks all dapper in his Army pants and shirt. There are women in these photographs as well. While the focus was on Lakota leaders, he also produced photographs of Indian women. This is a surprisingly warm, and many of the other photographs are very stoic, very apersonal. But this is a very warm and kind of view of Rocky Bear from Red Cloud's band. And here's American Horse from, this time he was a leader in the Wagluhe or Loafer band, and with two of his wives at that time, seen wearing the scalp shirt, his older wife and younger wife. We've been corresponding with the American Horse family, trying to decipher, or trying to identify each of the wives, to be able to put names to them as well. And then this is the last photograph I'll just briefly show you. David Rodnecker came to the Red Cloud Agency just as it was being shut down and produced a series of photographs of the agency as it was being essentially evacuated. And there were not a lot of Native people left. But you can see the Red Cloud Agency buildings in the background. There's the Yates store on the left and the John Deere store on the Frank Yates store on the right and the Deere store on the left. So now we go through just a series of photographs very quickly that are all brand new to us, have never been published before. They've just kind of recently been purchased and are in collector's hands now. We don't know who the photographers are yet. They may be among the photographers we saw here. But what's surprisingly wonderful about these 1877 photographs is the level of detail and the almost snapshot kind of quality to them. Not this formal posed views, but here are these kind of almost kind of very casual photographs, if you will. So here you have a great shot looking out. There's the views to your right, right behind the Red Cloud Agency. Great view of a period, a pack saddle, travois out there in the background. And here we see a group, Ogallala, presumably in among some flowers there on the grass in a very formal way. The person on the left covering her face or his face to not be seen. So as we look at photographs, as with a critical eye, look at the culture and try to understand what we're seeing, sometimes we want to see the people, but also we should look at what can we learn from these photographs. Again, I'm interested in Teoshbe and leadership. This is a photograph taken of the prominent leaders who came to Washington, D.C. in 1877 to meet with President Hayes. And I want you to notice all the prominent individuals are a number of what we would call the agency chiefs that are there who've been at the agency in the 1870s, as well as some of the northern leaders. So here's He-Dog Arthur over here standing on the left. So you can see American Horse, Little Big Man, Young Man Afraid of His Horses. This is Little Woman right here, and so on. I want you to notice very carefully that around several individuals, there's what looks like a cross made from German silver. Let's just kind of zoom in on a couple of these photographs. Here's the He-Dog image. Take a look at what it is that's right here. I think sometimes a cross is a misnomer. It's a flat piece of German silver. We will see these items in photographs being worn by various prominent headmen in a kind of a plus sign with usually a design of some kind on them. And so the question is, can we look at these photographs and interpret what they could possibly represent? If we look at people like Young Man Afraid of His Horses, he has the exact same medallion piece on in this 1877 photograph as well as in this 1890s photograph. It's something of great value. He has worn it to Washington, D.C. when he met with the president. It would be like putting on your best suit of clothing when you went to meet a diplomatic activity. It's something of great value, clearly, to these individuals. So what does it mean to us? We don't know the answer yet. Maybe somewhere, somebody here can help us decide that. But here is a drawing, Ogallala drawing from 1881 called Big Road Roster. As the Ogallala coming into the Standing Rock Agency to surrender, the Indian agent has asked one of the Ogallala to give them a listing of all the family members who are surrendering. And what this artist does is make a little head, a glyph, for each head of family, and then put a little symbol above the head to represent that person's name. And then you'll notice, as we zoom in on a couple of these photographs, a couple of these illustrations, it's just the most basic information. You'll see a number of stripes on the cheek that indicate whether they're in Kichita, whether they're, what their role is in that society. Some of them are holding you see the emblem for the pipe and the pipe bag, again, representing their position within Lakota leadership. Some are having a war club, presumably a Kichita leader. And then notice, in several of these drawings, again, we see these German kind of plus signs, these cross signs illustrated there. They must have some symbology, they must have some meaning in terms of leadership. The artist wasn't just doing random drawings, he was only putting information on them that would communicate a status of that individual. So the point is that these photographs suggest to us that these German silver crosses are some kind of, communicate something about that person's role. But the question ultimately is, can the traditional sources help us to kind of verify what those may have been. I should point out that if you look at the names of these people, that's He Dog, Little Hawk, the same people we'll see in the photographs wearing the crosses are the same ones that appear in the drawings with the crosses as well. All right. So photographs can help us to get a sense of what a place looks like. They can get a sense of what these people are. They give us a sense of who they really are, not just names in the census ledger, but a sense of them as a human being. And these are some great photographs, again, from 1877 of the Red Cloud Agency. These are all Oglala. Some of these may be family members or relatives of yours, but they have no names or no identification of who they are. But again, what's wonderful about them is just this kind of informal snapshot quality. So there you see behind you the warehouse, the two-story warehouse. So there's the door where you would go in to turn in your ration ticket. And here we have a group of young ladies with their fancy blankets wrapped around them. And notice in this time period, as the men are wearing the solid-colored, for the most part, the solid-colored blankets. The women have the woven blankets that they're wearing in this time period. We have lots of views of various village sites, campsites showing meat drawing on traditional racks. Lots of photographs of, of women, of children, of papooses on a horse saddle there. You can see it. There's several portraits of women in the traditional elk tooth dresses. And here she's in her formal gear with the dentalium earrings, the shell at the end of them. So this would have been a very fancy, very expensive dress for the time period. We have no idea what this image is. This is part of the set. We'd love to know more about what's happening in this image. It's clearly important. He's waving something that looks like, he and I were arguing about whether it's an eagle wing or what it might be. There's a lot of things happening in these illustrations that a traditional person may be able to help identify what is happening in this event. Lots of getting photographs of women, so they've not overlooked Ladonna. And then I guess that was the last one that ended on there. All right, so I just want to make sure you understand that, again, as historical documents, don't ignore the photographs in your personal collections. Understand that they're valuable. It's actually easy to have them scanned and have them preserved, to put on the CDs, to share with the family members, and to ensure they're available. But also take a look at them and understand them as historical documents. We look at photographs as an entire body of work. We look at the whole photographer's work. We understand what they did, why they took the pictures they took, and what they took the pictures of. An effort to kind of tease out some information about them that help us understand, again, something about Oglala Lakota history. Thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim. The only question I have, have you ever seen any pictures taken at that time where they were smiling?
So the challenge in photography in this 19th century for anyone is to be able to hold a smile in the same motion without moving. And so generally in the 19th century, for anyone's photograph, any portrait, formal portrait, you would try to keep your face relaxed and so you wouldn't be smiling. And in fact, in some of the early 1860s photographs, you'll see, if you look very carefully, there's be a little stand by their feet. Some of the great portraits by Alexander Gardner of some of the Lakota delegations, the Oglala ruling delegations in D.C., you can see in the background these little kind of stands that will hold the neck stable and try to hold it as still as possible because there's sometimes a several seconds. In the early years, all up to 30 seconds, you have to stand still in order for the photograph to be sharp and clear. By the 1870s, when these photographs are taken, you only have a couple seconds. So traditionally, you don't see a lot of smiling, in part because of that. Any other thoughts or questions? Or
I have a question.
yes.
The later portraits, that group of 80-some
Yes.
that gentleman took, do you think those were cropped as
Oh,
some of
thank
the
you.
older, or do you think maybe they eventually got to bring in their own?
So
line?
here's the question. So I'm finishing up a book right now on the D.S. Mitchell portraits. And so let's go all back up to the he dog image at the very beginning. And I know that one of the first questions was, are those props? So take a look at what he's actually carrying, what he's holding. So one way to figure out props is, first of all, he took all these series of photographs essentially within a 1 or 2 day period. You can imagine the photographer got his studio set up, and he's now working with an interpreter to bring in each of these Lakota leaders, have a picture taken, and move on. So if you could line up all these photographs and compare them, and then what you would see is the same item appearing in each one of the photographs. And what we'll actually find is, if we look at, not this particular photograph, but the ones which are holding the peace pipe, there's actually 2 pipes that reappear again and again through all the images. Now the question is, did the photographer bring that? He came all the way out to Nebraska by wagon, or is that something he happened to pick up there at the agency and had to hold it? But if you look at the other photographs, there are lots of things that are unique. So in the case of He Dog, for example, notice that he has a unique metal cross on his chest. The earring on his left with the abalone shell is unique. The 3-bladed war club he's holding, that's unique. It doesn't appear in any other photograph. And so the argument would be that most of those items that only appear one time are probably things that they would brought to the studio themselves. So they're dressing up in their best attire, they're coming in their Sunday best, if you will. But each one of these items are meant to communicate something. Now think about this, if I'm walking down the street and I see a policeman, just by looking at what he's wearing, or a priest, or whatever, that tells me something about their role in society or their status in society. So when I look at this, if you were Lakota in the 1870s, what would that communicate to you? He's holding a 3-bladed war club, which is one of the symbols of a headman of a Nikichita. So He Dog will eventually become a band leader in a traditional sense of a civil leader, but in the 1870s era, he's being viewed much as kind of a younger, he was married the year before, so he's at this point a young rising leader among the Sorback band, and so he's in some kind of a Nikichita level society, most likely. But again, I think it's open for discussion and looking at some of the oral traditions and folks who know this information well. So the point is, in these photographs, some of them are props and some of them are not. So the question is, can we tease out those and then understand something about what that means about that person?
A little clarification, Ephraim. And I don't know if those of you in the audience picked that up, the term called a sculpture. It is not a sculpture in as much as they're the leaders, what each would say. And you could probably say that they were the executive directors. They carried out the orders of the Najas, the leaders, and they did all the work. Crazy Horse, for example, was a Wakichunze before he became a Naja, or a chief, or leader. And he got involved, men are men, and sometimes they steal women, take a woman, and he did that when he was young. And that's where No Water shot him and missed him, grazed his cheek. And so that shirt he wore was taken away from him at that time because there were standards that had to be maintained. So, little correction, it's not a sculpture.
Yeah, and perhaps just to confirm there about the knife club that Enoch's carrying here. He's carrying the same item in photographs taken in Washington a few weeks before, after. So I think the assumption is good there that Ephraim said that it's his, it belongs to him, part of his regalia, symbols of his authority within the tribe. Could I just go back to my talk 2 days before? You remember the sketch the Frenchman did in the 1670s of a man carrying a stylized war club in the shape of a snake about to strike. Here, 200 years almost to the day, as it were later, here is a man carrying a similar snake effigy war club in the fashion of its time, with a continuity of ideas.
Another comment, you had asked a question about the cross that the leaders were given, German silver crosses. I've been told that it again comes from the perspective. In the perspective that it was given, it's a cross, and it denotes the Christianity believes it denotes the cross that Jesus Christ was crucified on. On the other hand, from the Lakota perspective, it provided the 4 directions that they could see. Although one is longer than the other, they still symbolize the fact that they were in the 4 directions, the 1 direction above, and the 1 direction below, and then the center. So that's how they, in their perception, would probably have seen that cross. Not that they're baptized and they're now Christian supported, but that in their perspective was the perspective of the whole world. Offer that as a suggestion to
I think what's also interesting to look at photographs is because of the way they're dated, what we'll find is that these silver crosses don't actually appear in photographs in Lakota until the early 1870s. But if you back up, you'll see them among the Cheyenne in the 1860s. So what you see is, one theory is that it's a style that's been adopted, that's moved north, along with other styles, clothing styles that moved north from the southwest into the Cheyenne, into the Lakota, eventually to the north.
As I understand, one of the gifters of this cross was Father DeSmith. And he traveled the Missouri River all the way through, so as he traveled, he met the Lakotas and then the Cheyennes, and then onward, wherever he ran out of it was, I don't know, but you'll find that in all those locations.
I just wanted to comment. All these photographs, the people look great. They're beautiful. Their skin is flawless. Their hair is dark. And that's probably attributed to their diet compared to how we look today. We look very different from who we descend from. One of my uncles, before he passed away, his name was Charles Blindman. And I remember he was really, really sick. But I remember as he was getting back towards his last days, he had the most beautiful bone structure. And, I see that in these. And sometimes we still see our ancestors, like, I'm a portrait artist. And I go to town and I say, oh, look at that place. I said, that's a snapshot from, who we used to be. And then because of our diet, our fast food and high starch and everything, it's really changed how we look today. Like there isn't a single person in there that has gray hair. You don't see it. So whatever it is that they used to eat was great. And whatever it is we're eating now, it manifests itself in how we look. So I just wanted to say that. Our people were beautiful, and I think the characteristics of each tribe is dominant. One of the most dominant things, not only are you looking for lineage, but you're also looking at, like we can see another tribe, and we know that they're not our tribe just by the way we look. It's kind of an innate thing, not only because they may be shorter, but I think by general rule, I think Lakota people are taller, and they have a more Asian appearance. When we were in Japan with the grandmothers, we were just amazed at seeing all these Japanese people, because then you'd say, oh, look, that looks like so-and-so, and that looks like so-and-so. It was like, we didn't go to a different country across the world. It looks like it was like a tribal nation-to-nation visit, because in Japan, they were just so similar to how we are, their essence or spirit. So I think that's also an important component to doing your genealogy. It's also to know the physicality of who each distinct group of people are. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
I'll also add to that, if you look at photographs of, modern photographs, most of us probably here could recognize, well, that's a 1950s era clothing, that's a 1960s era. Oh my gosh, I can't remember, I can't believe I wore that in the 70s or whatever. And the same thing happens in Lakota culture as well. You're actually able to recognize clothing styles that change over time. And so one thing you'll notice, for example, is that none of them have eyebrows. So they in the 1870s, very common culture would be to pluck your eyebrows, as even both men and women. And so all the hair, all any mustache or beard hair would be plucked with a pair of tweezers. And in fact, one of the photographers noted that when they Lakota came in for their portrait, there would be all the men would be in there with a pair of tweezers to prepare themselves before they got the picture taken. You'd see red, essentially black and white, but you can see the color and the part of the hair for women. So there's a variety of other things that are cultural, and that really things shift over time. There's a great story told in the Bent Papers about how the northern Cheyenne, who are associated with Lakota, have adopted Lakota clothing styles. And then when they go down to visit southern Cheyenne relatives, they're all getting teased by their relatives as how you become, look at you, look how you're dressed, you become Lakota. So if we'd lived in the 1870s, we could have done the same thing. We could look at somebody not only from body, but also the clothing styles and said, we know exactly who you are, what tribe you belong to, etc.
One question I have is, we have a bunch of photographs from our family. Is how did, was there a trade for, in terms of, I'm taking a photograph of you, I'm gonna give you food. How did we acquire?
So Arthur's asking about how did you acquire photographs in the 1870s? And it's very different depending on the time period. By the 1870s, oftentimes, for example, these photographs you see with D.S. Mitchell, the records indicate that they're actually requesting for them to be paid to be able to sit. Red Cloud will ask, to be paid, they have his picture taken. But many of them will have their photograph taken and then would be presented a photograph, and this individual now has the negative, and then they would take the negative and sell, reprint and sell images. Spottown makes a comment in 1874. He says, please allow yourself to be photographed as a way of communicating to these Americans who don't know who the Lakota are. It's a way of communicating about our culture and our identity and see us as real people and as human beings. But there's always this concern about how would these images be utilized. There's potential they could be utilized in a negative way as well to reinforce negative stereotypes. So that's certainly what photographers are playing to their audience of who eventually will buy those photographs. By the 1880s, however, what you'll see is, for example, the photography studios in Chadron, just off reservation, people like Graves and others that they're commercial photographers. So Oklahoma would come into the photography studio and just pay to have their portraits just like anyone else would, and then take the images home. A few years ago, I think you remember there was a whole negative collection, a glass plate negative collection for the Graves that was found in Chadron when they were tearing down a building, and from around 1910 about 1915. And that included the last known portraits of Red Cloud, as well as many Oglala families coming down from the reservation. Unfortunately, with no identification. Someday it'd be great to be able to bring these images around and see if they can identify one and see if people recognize family members. But, so in most cases, you would purchase or trade for them.
Excuse me. I'll be sitting here listening and talking about the cross. I was just wondering, way back then, way back in the 18 when the Jesuits came into the United States, all over the Indian land, not only here in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And I'm just wondering, did they tell the people, they give them the cross, okay, nice and shiny, did they tell them then why they got the cross like that? Did they ever tell them why that Jesus was crucified? Was that ever spoken to them Indians way back then? Because I went to school at the Holy Rosary. And of course they give us the cross. And as a little girl, I seen the cross and I seen Jesus on there, crucified. And I'm just sitting here wondering if the Jesuits could come and then put that cross on them, take a picture of them. They didn't know that. They didn't go and explain that to that. Well, here's a cross that, Jesus was crucified on there, so put it on. It's just the cross, plain cross that they put on them. You don't know. Nobody don't know. But the people that came then, the Jesuits and the big guys that came, they put the cross on an Indian, make them dress up, and take a picture of them. Thank you.
thoughts or questions? We could turn it back over to Leonard. All right, well, thank you. It's been a great honor to be here today, and I appreciate your listening and great opportunity to share with you some of the information you've been finding. Thank you.